They called her a burden, not with shouts, not with slurs. No, their weapons were sharper, quieter, a tilted glance. A sigh through clenched teeth, a whisper just loud enough to slice through silence. Margaret stood in the kitchen, folding towels with hands worn by years. Her back ached, but her soul ached more. The voices came from the living room, her son, Evan, and his wife, Rachel. They didn't know she was listening. Or maybe they didn't care. She's not helping, Rachel hissed. She just sits, she takes up space. She raised me, Evan said, but his voice wavered like a man who already knew which side he'd chosen. She's dead weight. The towel slipped from Margaret's fingers. For a moment, the house was silent. Then her voice, low, trembling but unbroken, broke through the quiet. I heard you. Rachel froze mid-step. Evan turned. Mom. No, Margaret said. Don't lie, don't soften it. You said it and now it lives in the room with us. There was no apology, no rush to undo the damage, only more silence. Margaret returned to her folding, her hands quivering not from fear but from something else, resolve, perhaps, beginning to stir. That night during dinner, her arthritic fingers betrayed her. A bowl of soup slipped from her grip, shattering its contents across the table and into Rachel's lap. Seriously? Rachel barked, dabbing at her skirt with disgust. I'm sorry, Margaret murmured, reaching for a napkin. Before she could reach, Rachel slapped her hand away, then, without hesitation, slapped her face. The room stilled, the air tightened. Evan didn't speak, didn't move. His eyes met Margaret's for a moment, then turned away. That was the moment Margaret knew. Her son wouldn't defend her, not even now, not even against this. Then the door creaked open. Her daughter Elaine stood there, unexpected, unannounced, suitcase still in hand, fresh from signing divorce papers in another city. She'd called 3 nights ago, crying so hard Margaret could barely understand her. Now she stood, eyes wide, mouth open, taking in the red mark on her mother's cheek, the overturned bowl, the silence that followed a slap. Elaine didn't ask questions, she walked straight to Rachel and hit her. The slap echoed like justice finally remembered. You touch my mother again, Elaine said, voice like steel, and I will make sure you never touch anything again. Rachel stumbled back, stunned. Evan stood up, shocked. You don't live here, he snapped. You don't get to barge in. Elaine turned on him. You let your wife hit Mom and said nothing. You let her call her a burden, and you stood there. You did nothing. She just takes up space, Evan snapped. Just like you, a divorced parasite who ran back to Mommy. Elaine flinched, not from his words but from recognition. She had heard that tone before, slept beside it. Let it crush her for years. You're just like her, Evan spat. Useless. That was when Margaret rose. She stepped between them. Enough. The room fell still, even time seemed to pause. She turned to Elaine. You are not useless. Then to Evan. You are no longer my son. Evan opened his mouth but nothing came. Margaret walked away, sat by the window where they thought she wasted hours staring into nothing, but she wasn't staring. She was remembering, calculating, awakening. They called her dead weight, but Margaret had carried more than they ever would. She carried them. She had sold her home, a little brick house where she raised Evan, survived widowhood and lived through winters that cracked her joints and warmed her heart. When Evan and Rachel wanted to buy their dream home, she gave without hesitation. She paid the down payment, moved into the guest room between the laundry and the garage. No windows, no comfort. Just a mattress on the floor and the lie she told herself, I belong. She didn't ask to be on the deed, didn't want to make them feel guilty. She thought, I'll be close to the grandkids, I'll help, I'll be needed. She helped more than they would ever admit. She cooked, cleaned, sang lullabies, paid bills, even covered the mortgage when they couldn't. Quietly, monthly, without recognition. They called her a burden, but Margaret was the foundation. Every night she sat alone, thinking of the porch swing she gave up, the daffodils she planted, her name carved into a wooden beam next to a child's. She remembered Evan as a boy making macaroni birthday cards. That boy was gone. Replaced by a man who turned his head when cruelty passed by. And still she stayed. Until one day Rachel slapped her hand away over spilled soup. And Evan said nothing. That was the last thread. Margaret called the bank. Her name was still on the payment line. Quietly, calmly, she told them to stop the auto debits, to send all future bills to Evan and Rachel. Then she printed the confirmation letter, slid it into an envelope. Cooked dinner one last time. When the table was set, she placed 3 plates. Evan's favorite lentil soup, fresh bread, and beside the salt shaker, the envelope. "What's that?" Rachel asked, reaching for it. Margaret wiped her hands on her napkin. "That," she said, "is the last mortgage payment I will ever make." Evan looked up from his plate. "Mom." "I heard you last week," she said, voice steady. "I heard what you called me, dead weight. And now I am removing that weight. I've paid your mortgage for 3 years," she continued. "Groceries, repairs, diapers, school projects, I've cooked every meal, stayed silent through every insult. Folded your laundry while you laughed at my cooking, but now." She lifted a small suitcase from beside her chair. "The givers are done giving." Rachel rose, voice high. "You can't just leave. What about the kids?" "What about?" "I can," Margaret said, "and I am." Evan looked like a boy again. "Mom, please." She turned to him, her eyes quiet. "You let her slap me, you stood there, you didn't stop her. And when your sister tried to defend me, you called her trash. You chose silence, you chose her, over me." Evan's eyes welled with tears, but Margaret didn't soften. "I'll be gone by morning," she said. "You'll get the keys. Do what you like with the room, turn it into a playroom, call it whatever you want. I won't be here to see it." He whispered, "Where will you go?" She smiled, "Somewhere I'm not dead weight." That night she packed her things, a few sweaters, her birth certificate, her pension paperwork, her late husband's watch, a photo of Evan and Elaine when they were still small and innocent. She brewed coffee one last time, placed the house key on the counter. No note, no goodbye. Only the click of the door and the quiet, determined footsteps of a woman choosing herself. That morning she boarded a bus bound for the south, a suitcase bumping gently behind her, a breeze brushing her cheeks like welcome. She didn't cry. There was nothing left to grieve, only chapters still unwritten. The bus hummed beneath her, a soft, rhythmic rattle that blended with the hum of the highway and the hush of early morning regrets. Margaret sat near the window, her suitcase tucked beneath her feet, her hands folded over a worn leather purse that held everything of importance. Her life didn't weigh much anymore, just a few pounds of paper, fabric, and memory. The bus wasn't crowded, half full at best. She was grateful for that. She didn't need company, she needed quiet. Out the window, cities faded into towns, then into stretches of trees and fields. The world grew quieter the farther she moved from them. Evan, Rachel, the house that had never really felt like home. She had lived there like a whisper. Now she was learning how to speak again. The bus stopped occasionally. Rest stops. Gas stations. Margaret didn't get off. She had a sleeve of crackers in her coat pocket, a bottle of water, that was enough. Everything else she craved couldn't be bought at a vending machine. She thought about Elaine. The way her daughter had stood in that room, fire in her voice, steel in her spine. It had been so long since Margaret had seen anyone fight for her. It was like remembering she had a name again. Elaine had always been the soft one. Sensitive, emotional, but Margaret now saw that sensitivity wasn't weakness, it was strength trained in silence. Elaine had left a man who belittled her, who bruised her, who took and told her she was lucky to be loved at all. Margaret remembered those phone calls, Elaine crying in broken whispers, ashamed and scared. "I don't know how to leave," she'd said. Now Margaret was the one arriving. When the bus pulled into the station in Sarasota, the air was thicker, warmer. But something about it felt softer. Even the wind felt different, like it didn't push so hard here. Margaret stepped off the bus, her suitcase bumping behind her like a loyal shadow. She hadn't told Elaine exactly when she was coming. She didn't want to make a scene, she didn't want pity or parades. She just wanted peace. Elaine's apartment complex sat on a quiet street, nestled between palm trees and cracked sidewalks. The building was beige, the paint peeling slightly, the railing rusted at the corners, but it felt real, lived in, honest. Margaret climbed the stairs slowly. Arthritis made each step feel longer, but she didn't rush. This was a climb she chose. She knocked twice, waited. Elaine opened the door and froze. "Mom," she whispered. They stared at each other, two women shaped by years of holding things in. Margaret saw the faint makeup on Elaine's face, the kind that tried to cover old bruises. She noticed her daughter wasn't wearing her wedding ring. Neither of them were. No questions were asked. Elaine simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother. And Margaret let herself be held not as a burden but as a mother, a woman, a person who mattered. They didn't speak much that first day. Elaine made tea. Margaret sat at the small kitchen table watching her daughter move around a space that was entirely her own. The apartment was small, just one bedroom, a worn-out couch, a second-hand table, but it felt more like home than anything Margaret had known in years. That night they sat side by side on the couch as the rain tapped softly against the windows. The world outside melted away, leaving just the two of them and the quiet. "He used to call me garbage," Elaine said suddenly. Margaret turned, but her daughter didn't meet her eyes. She stared at the floor, hands clenched in her lap. "Not just when we fought," Elaine continued. "All the time, when dinner was late, when I forgot to buy the right brand of milk. When I breathed wrong." Margaret's heart clenched, but she didn't speak. "He said even my own mother didn't want me." Elaine looked up then, her eyes brimming with pain far older than the bruises. "Was he right?" Margaret reached for her hand. It was cold, trembling. "No," she said firmly, "he was never right." Elaine broke down, collapsing into her mother's lap like the child she once was. Margaret held her, rocked her. Let her cry it all out, and when the tears dried, she whispered, "If you can't leave yet, I'll carry you out myself." They began to rebuild from there, quietly, carefully. Elaine started saving her paychecks. Margaret helped her create a list of what she'd need. They rehearsed what she'd say when she left, who she'd call, where she could go. It wasn't about running, it was about reclaiming. One morning, Elaine stood in the doorway with divorce papers in her hand. She was shaking. "I signed them," she said. "It's time." Margaret rose from her chair and wrapped her in an embrace that said everything. "You saved me," Elaine whispered. "No," Margaret replied, "we saved each other." They found the apartment by accident. It was small, tucked above a seafood market just a block from the beach. The walls were thin, the plumbing temperamental. But the windows caught the sunrise like it was art. Elaine stood in the doorway, lease in hand, her voice trembling. "Can we really do this?" "We already are," Margaret said. They moved in with only the essentials, a few bags of clothes. A kettle, 2 folding chairs, a second-hand sofa that smelled faintly of cinnamon. They didn't bring the past with them, just the pieces of themselves they were still learning to love. Their days found rhythm. Elaine revived an old hobby, handmade jewelry. Margaret helped with packaging and shipping. They called their little venture Mother and Daughter Goods. The name stuck. Margaret began baking again, small batches at first, banana bread, oatmeal cookies, butter rolls. They posted photos online, orders trickled in. Then grew, neighbors came, tourists called. They didn't make much, but they didn't need much. Each morning, Margaret sat by the window with her journal, not to remember but to release. She wrote about the past, the pain, the joy, the small triumphs. She wrote about Elaine's laughter, about the sea breeze, about how it felt to finally be seen. Elaine painted again, not for galleries or likes, but for herself. She painted seashells, postcards, frames they hung around the apartment. At night, they'd eat on the floor, simple meals with soft music in the background. They didn't talk about Evan or Rachel. They didn't need to. The absence spoke enough. One night, Margaret glanced over and saw Elaine asleep on the sofa, a smile on her lips. A real smile, the kind that came from safety. And in that moment, Margaret knew. She had not just left a house. She had walked out of a silence that had swallowed her for years. She had chosen to live. And now she was alive. It arrived quietly, like most things that matter do. A simple envelope tucked between bills and flyers, its edges crumpled and one corner smudged with something that looked like grape jelly. No return address, just a heart drawn beside her name in pencil. Margaret turned it over in her hands, careful not to tear the seal. Her fingers shook not from age but from something deeper. Recognition. This was Lily's handwriting. Her granddaughter. She opened it slowly, like it might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Dear Grandma, I hope you are happy. I miss you. I miss your cookies. I miss your hugs. I told Mommy and Daddy." Mommy cried. Daddy went outside. "I hope I see you again. Love. Lily." There was a drawing folded inside. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands in front of a house. Margaret's old house. The one she gave up. The one she had poured herself into for decades. Lily had drawn a big smile on the taller figure's face. Margaret sat down near the window, sunlight pooling on the floor like warmth returning to her bones. She held the letter to her heart and closed her eyes. She didn't cry, not at first. She just breathed. Line by line, she read it again, slower this time, as if absorbing the words into her bloodstream. And then, when the apartment was quiet, when Elaine was curled beneath a blanket in the other room, Margaret read it one more time. And this time she cried, but not from sorrow. She cried for everything she had held back, For every dinner served cold because she waited for others to eat first. For every insult she swallowed to keep peace that never came. For every time Evan looked away, she cried for Lily too, because children always carry the weight of what adults refuse to fix. But she didn't regret leaving. That was the difference between grief and guilt. Grief says, I miss what I loved. Guilt says, I should have stayed. Margaret had carried both for years. That night she finally set one down. The next morning, before the sun crested the edge of the sea, she rose early, boiled water, sliced lemons. Set a cup of tea out for Elaine to find when she woke. Then she sat at their tiny kitchen table and wrote back, Dear Lily, I miss you too. My cookies still smell the same. I started growing basil and lavender. Sometimes I bake cinnamon bread just for the smell of it. The beach here is soft and quiet. The seagulls are pushy little things who always want my toast. I hope you're still drawing. Your picture made me smile so big my cheeks hurt. She didn't mention the house, or Evan, or Rachel. That wasn't Lily's burden to carry. She was just a child. And children deserve to feel wanted, not like furniture wedged between guilt and grown-up silence. Margaret pressed a dried violet into the envelope, wrote to Lily with love in her neatest cursive, though her hand shook. She mailed it that afternoon, and when she returned to the apartment she felt lighter, not because things were fixed, but because she had chosen to speak. For years she had convinced herself that being needed was the same as being loved, that if she stayed small, stayed useful, stayed quiet, she'd be appreciated. But silence had only made her invisible. Now her words took up space, and she let them. Elaine noticed the shift. You're humming again, she said one evening, smiling from the kitchen. Margaret laughed. Am I? You are. Elaine came over, took her mother's hand, and spun her once awkwardly, joyfully in the middle of the living room. They danced for no reason, because the rice was cooking, because the window was open, because they could. Later that week they planted rosemary on the balcony. For protection, Elaine said. You don't need protection anymore, Margaret replied. You have yourself now, and me. Some nights they sat on the porch and played old music. Elaine read articles from her phone. Margaret told stories she had never had the courage to share before about her childhood, her dreams, the things she gave up without realizing. She spoke like someone rediscovering her own voice. And Elaine listened like someone reclaiming a history she thought was lost. Margaret no longer apologized for taking up space. She sang in the kitchen, off-key and loud. She wrote letters to strangers who followed their baking page. She wore her favorite earrings even when no one was visiting. She mattered, not because she was needed, but because she was Margaret. One day, while sweeping the floor, she heard Elaine humming the same tune Margaret used to sing while braiding her hair before school. And that's when she knew healing was no longer just hers. It had begun to echo, and echoing it would keep them both alive. The phone rang on a Tuesday. Margaret was by the window, pruning dead leaves from a basil plant. The air smelled of lemon and lavender. Elaine was in the kitchen humming while stirring soup. Outside, the sun warmed the windows like a soft breath from the universe itself. The phone screen lit up, an area code she recognized. A number she hadn't seen in months. She almost didn't answer, but something told her to. Grandma, a tiny voice whispered. Margaret's heart tightened. Lily. I'm fine, the child said quickly like she'd rehearsed it. But Mommy and Daddy are scared. The bank sent a letter. Margaret sat down. They were yelling last night. Daddy said they're going to lose the house. Another pause. He said it was your house first. Margaret didn't reply. There was a shuffle on the other end, then a click, and Evan's voice, unsteady, unfamiliar. Mom. She hadn't heard that word from him since the day she walked out. I'm sorry, he said, all in one breath. I should have stopped her. I should have defended you. I was scared. I thought we had more time. Margaret didn't say anything. He continued. The house, it's falling apart. We're being threatened with foreclosure. The kids, they don't understand. I tried to fix it, but I can't. He broke off. We need help, please come back. Margaret's voice when it came was soft but clear. Why are you calling me now? He didn't respond. She continued. Do you remember the day Rachel called me dead weight? His breath hitched. Yes. Do you remember what you did? Silence. Nothing, she answered for him. You did nothing. And then you called your sister a parasite. You stood beside cruelty. You chose comfort over courage. And now you remember I exist because the bank does too. He sobbed once. Please, Mom, I know I don't deserve. She closed her eyes. "I was a burden to you then," she said. "But I'm not anymore." And then she said the line she'd been holding in her chest, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. "I used to carry that house. Now I carry myself." He whispered, "What should I tell the kids?" She smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Tell them their grandmother is doing just fine." She ended the call, no goodbye, no promises, just peace. Elaine looked up from the kitchen. "Was that?" "Yes," Margaret said, setting the phone down. "It was." Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Margaret returned to her pruning. The basil thrived that summer. Elaine began painting little jars of sand, affixing cards with poems, and sending them to customers who wanted to remember a beach they'd never visited. Margaret baked cinnamon rolls just for the smell. They mailed postcards to Lily without return addresses, drawings of fish, stickers of seashells, short notes about sunrises and seagulls that tried to steal toast. They weren't hiding. They were simply living. The apartment with its creaky air conditioner and chipped walls had become their sanctuary, not just a refuge but a launchpad. Margaret no longer flinched at sudden noises. Elaine no longer jumped when her phone buzzed. Their mornings began with tea and sea breezes. Their nights ended with books and laughter. They didn't talk about the past, not because they were avoiding it, but because it no longer dictated their present. One humid afternoon, Margaret was kneading dough. The curtains fluttered. The smell of honey and yeast filled the air. Then the phone rang again. Same number. She didn't answer. Elaine's phone buzzed. She didn't move. The third call went to voicemail. Then another, then silence. Elaine finally picked it up, tapped play, Michael's voice hollow now. "Mom, Elaine, it's bad. The debts were being evicted. Everything's crumbling. We don't know where to go, please. Just call back." There was no rage in his tone, no blame, just the sound of a man drowning in the weight he once ignored. Elaine set the phone down, blocked the number. Margaret did the same. No words were exchanged. No glee. No bitterness, only stillness. The kind that follows storms when the sky remembers how to breathe. They had nothing left to fix, nothing left to explain, and no one left to apologize to. They had given Evan and Rachel more than money. More than shelter, more than forgiveness. They had given them time, chances, pieces of themselves. And when kindness could have changed everything, those two had chosen power. When they could have stood for love, they chose silence. Now they were reaping silence in return. Sometimes Margaret wondered if Rachel still rolled her eyes at waitstaff. If Evan ever opened the pantry and saw the name he carved beside hers, now forgotten. If they remembered the warmth she carried with her and felt the cold that followed when she left. But she never lingered on those thoughts, because they were theirs to carry, not hers. She had sunrises to catch, stories still unwritten. And a daughter beside her who laughed again. They walked barefoot on the beach some mornings, the tide kissing their ankles. They didn't speak much during those walks. They didn't need to. The ocean said enough. Its rhythm wasn't just forgiveness, it was freedom, not for others, but for themselves. The mornings were no longer quiet out of sadness. They were quiet because peace doesn't need to announce itself. Margaret began each day with a ritual: water boiling, lemon slices laid out, 2 cups on the counter. One for herself, one for Elaine. Sometimes they drank together in the living room, feet curled beneath them like girls sharing secrets. Sometimes they drank apart, Elaine on the balcony, Margaret by the kitchen window. They had learned how to be together without needing to speak. It was a kind of intimacy that only comes from shared survival. Margaret had stopped counting how many days it had been since she left the house where she was never wanted. Now she counted other things. Batches of cookies sold online. Letters from neighbors thanking them for the bread. Drawings from children tucked into their orders. Elaine's laughter, real now, unforced. Her shoulders no longer tensed when the doorbell rang. Her voice no longer lowered when she disagreed with someone. She had found her volume again. Margaret found hers in different ways. She planted herbs, not for cooking but for care, basil for clarity, lavender for calm, rosemary for protection, though she no longer felt she needed it. She began writing recipes by hand again, sending them out to followers on their small baking page. People began requesting more, not just bread and cookies, but stories. They wanted to know how she made things taste like home. She told them it wasn't the sugar or the butter, it was the silence she baked through, the prayers she folded into dough, the years of holding back that now poured out in teaspoons and pinches. One woman wrote back, "Your banana bread saved my marriage." Margaret smiled, not because it was true, but because maybe, just maybe, someone out there was remembering how to speak with sweetness instead of shouting. Elaine took on new orders, tiny jars of beach sand with handwritten poems, not because they were useful, but because they were beautiful. People bought them, not to fill shelves, but to feel something, anything. "We're not rich," Elaine joked once, "but we're full." And it was true. Their little apartment with its peeling paint and squeaky floorboards overflowed with life. They played music while folding laundry, danced barefoot across the kitchen while soup simmered, painted seashells with cheap acrylics, took photos of sunsets, swapped novels, wrote postcards they'd never send. They didn't talk about Evan. They didn't need to. He lived only in the lessons he failed to teach. That winter, Margaret received another letter from Lily. This time it was longer, the handwriting steadier. She wrote about school, about how she tried to bake cookies but burned them, about how she hugged a pillow at night and pretended it smelled like her grandmother's house. "I miss you every day," she wrote. "I don't understand why you had to go, but I hope wherever you are, they treat you like a queen." Margaret placed the letter on the windowsill beside a seashell Elaine had painted blue. She didn't cry this time. She wrote back, told Lily about the seagulls who tried to steal toast, about a cat that sat on their porch like it owned the place, about how cinnamon bread still filled the apartment with warmth. She didn't mention Evan. Lily didn't ask. Children are wiser than they seem. They know which questions to avoid and which truths to protect. Margaret often thought about that day, the soup, the slap, the silence, not with pain, but with clarity. It had been her awakening, not because someone hurt her, but because she finally recognized her own capacity to walk away. For years, she thought loyalty meant staying, enduring, being quiet. She had mistaken sacrifice for virtue. But now she understood. Loyalty when one-sided is servitude, and love when conditional is control. Now her love was expansive. It filled their home, their days, their laughter. She was no longer someone's shadow, she was sunlight, Elaine noticed. "You laugh with your whole body now," she said one morning as Margaret giggled over a spilled jar of honey. "I didn't know I could," Margaret replied. They spent a weekend painting the balcony. Not because it needed it, but because they wanted to. They chose yellow, a soft, hopeful shade. They hung up twinkle lights, potted new herbs, bought a second-hand hammock and argued playfully over who would fall asleep in it first. At night, they sat outside, listening to the ocean and eating slices of watermelon. Elaine curled up beside her mother and whispered, "I used to think I'd never feel safe again." Margaret didn't speak, she just held her. Because some things don't need answers, they just need arms. When spring came, they started taking longer walks, sometimes through sleepy towns with peeling porches, sometimes to the market by the sea. Once they drove 2 hours just to watch wildflowers bloom on the side of a highway. Margaret took her journal everywhere, not to record, but to release. She no longer wrote about what she left behind. She wrote about who she had become, a woman who laughed loudly, who said no without guilt, who danced in her kitchen and forgave herself for ever thinking she was a burden, a woman who didn't just survive, she bloomed. The past has a way of knocking, even when you change the locks. Margaret had begun to believe the quiet would last. That peace once found would never again be interrupted. But life has its ways, subtle tremors in the ground, reminders that healing isn't always a straight line. It was a hot afternoon. The air smelled of cinnamon and salt. Margaret was kneading dough, her sleeves rolled up, a smile tucked into the corner of her mouth. Elaine was painting near the window, soft music drifting in and out of the room. Then the phone rang, not hers, Elaine's, a number neither of them recognized. It rang again, then again. Elaine let it go to voicemail, then picked it up, staring at the screen for a long moment before tapping play. It was Evan. His voice was different. No anger, no arrogance, just emptiness. "Mom, Elaine, it's bad, really bad. We made mistakes, Rachel and I, gambling, loans. We're being evicted, there's nowhere to go. The kids, I don't know what to do." He paused, a long, ragged silence. "Please just call back." He didn't sound like a man begging for forgiveness. He sounded like a man asking for rescue. Elaine looked at Margaret. She didn't say a word. Instead, she opened her phone, blocked the number, and set it down. Margaret did the same. No anger, no celebration, just stillness. There was no joy in their silence, only resolution. They had already given more than what was owed. Their love, their labor, their dignity. They had paid for groceries and schooling, comfort and convenience. They had shown up again and again, even when their presence was unwelcome, even when their names were said like curses. And when the moment came for Evan and Rachel to show grace, to defend love, to stand for something better, they chose silence. Now Margaret and Elaine chose the same silence, not as retreat, but as boundary, not out of vengeance, but out of wisdom. Some storms are not yours to calm, some people are not yours to save. They returned to their dough and paintbrushes, the apartment filled with the smell of butter and acrylic, the sound of living. Later that evening, Margaret stood on the balcony watching the sky blush orange and gold. Elaine joined her, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "You okay?" she asked. Margaret nodded. "I feel clear." Elaine smiled. "That's new." "Yes," Margaret said, "and it's mine." They clinked their mugs gently. Neither of them spoke about Evan again that week. Instead, they celebrated small victories. A 5-star review on their online shop. A postcard from a stranger in Montana. A new herb sprouting in their balcony garden. Elaine sold her first painting, just a tiny framed beach scene, but it felt like a trophy. "Someone saw it and wanted it," she said, her voice trembling. "That's what art does," Margaret replied. "It reminds people they're not alone." And that, she thought later, is what she was doing now, living like art. Existing boldly, vulnerably, without apology. They took a trip that weekend, just a small one. A rented car, a folded map, a thermos of lemon tea. They drove north through sleepy coastal towns, stopping to buy peaches from roadside stalls, taking blurry photos of odd billboards and overgrown cemeteries. They laughed at silly signs, at the way their hair curled in the humidity, at nothing and everything. In one small town, they found an abandoned hotel with ivy crawling over the sign. Elaine pulled over. "Let's take a photo," she said. "Of what?" "Of us in front of it." "Why?" Margaret laughed. "Because it's still standing," Elaine said, lifting her phone, "and so are we." The photo was blurry, off-center. Margaret's hair was windswept. Elaine's shirt was stained with coffee. But it was perfect, proof. They printed it when they got home, taped it above the kitchen table with a handwritten caption underneath, "We're still standing." Weeks passed, the phone didn't ring again, or if it did, they didn't notice. They were too busy. Baking, painting, mailing packages, laughing over burned muffins. Crying sometimes, but not from pain, from memory, from release, from grace. One night, Elaine found an old voicemail from Evan buried in her inbox. She didn't play it. She deleted it, then went to the living room and pulled her mother into a dance. No music, no rhythm, just movement, just joy. Margaret laughed so hard she cried. And then she whispered, "We're not broken." Elaine kissed her on the forehead. "No," she said, "we're rebuilding." They didn't mean to start traveling. It began with a postcard. Elaine found it tucked in a second-hand novel, used as a bookmark by someone who must have forgotten it. A faded image of the Smoky Mountains in spring. The colors were soft, almost washed out by time, but the flowers looked alive. Vibrant, wild. "We should go," she said, holding the card up to the light. Margaret smiled. "You're serious?" Elaine shrugged. "Why not?" So they packed a bag, a few sweaters, a thermos of tea, a paper map folded too many times. They printed directions, marked stops along the way, booked cheap motels. Margaret baked a tin of cookies. Elaine packed paintbrushes and a small sketchbook. And they drove, windows down, music low. 2 women moving toward a world they hadn't seen in years. The first time Margaret saw the wildflowers stretch across the valley, she cried, not from sadness but from awe. They bloomed with such reckless confidence, unbothered by whether anyone noticed. "I want to be like them," she whispered. "You already are," Elaine replied. They kept going, not just to the Smokies, but farther. Savannah in the fall, where trees bent low like old friends. Roadside diners with stories on the walls. 1 trip turned into 5. 5 turned into 10. They traveled not to escape, but to remember who they were, who they still were becoming. Margaret kept a journal through it all, not of schedules or plans, but of impressions. The sound of gravel under motel beds, the scent of rain on eucalyptus trees, the way Elaine tilted her head when she listened, the taste of pecan pie in a town neither of them could pronounce. Elaine sketched everything, bridges, reflections, the curve of her mother's hands as she kneaded dough in the kitchenette of a tiny roadside cabin. They sent Lily postcards, no return address, just drawings and jokes and small descriptions of strange birds and sunrises. They didn't know if she received them, but that wasn't the point. They were remembering how to give without expecting anything back. Margaret felt herself changing. Her joints still ached, her hair still grayed, but her spine straightened not from medicine but from meaning. She stopped apologizing for forgetting things, for laughing too loud, for speaking up. She wore her favorite hat even when it didn't match. She bought earrings from street vendors, ones shaped like suns and turtles and moons. She danced at gas stations when the right song played on the car radio. She let herself be big again. And Elaine, she began painting faces. Real ones, women like them, older, softer, louder, women who had once been erased. She sold prints online, sometimes gave them away for free. "This one's called Grace in Bloom," she said one day, showing Margaret a portrait she'd painted. It was unmistakably her mother. Margaret blinked at the canvas. "Is that really me?" Elaine nodded. "As I see you." Margaret couldn't speak. She just reached out and touched her daughter's hand. They moved again, not because they had to, but because they wanted more sky. A little apartment above a seafood shop, one street from the water. The walls were yellow, the porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a table. They didn't have a lot, but they had everything they needed. Each morning, Margaret sat on the porch with her tea, journal in hand. She didn't always write. Sometimes she just watched the gulls argue over breadcrumbs and felt the wind in her hair. Elaine began singing again, soft at first, then louder. Their laughter filled the rooms. One day, a neighbor dropped off an empty glass jar and said, "You too remind me of light." Elaine turned it into art, painted the jar, added dried flowers, tied a ribbon. They began giving them out to new neighbors, customers, strangers who looked like they needed hope. They called them light jars. People started asking for them, so they made more, and in each one Margaret slipped a note. "You are not invisible, you are not a mistake, you are light." They began to receive letters, stories from women who had watched their videos, read their baking blog, followed their journey. One wrote, "You reminded me I'm not too old to begin again." Another said, "After 40 years of marriage, I finally left. You gave me courage." Margaret read them slowly, carefully, letting each word seep into the places where doubt still tried to live. They weren't influencers, they were reminders. Proof that life after silence could be symphonies. Proof that healing doesn't have a deadline. Proof that some blooms only come after frost. Margaret sometimes thought about Evan, but not often. If his voice lived anywhere now, it was a faint echo, a page in a chapter she had already finished. Sometimes she wondered if Lily still drew stick figures of them holding hands, if she still baked cookies, if she still remembered the smell of cinnamon and lavender. But Margaret didn't let the wondering steal the present. She had tea to brew, dough to rise, sea breeze to chase. Elaine had just begun a new painting, this one of their porch, with the sky curling orange and pink behind it. "What should I call it?" she asked. Margaret didn't hesitate. "Home." Margaret once believed that wisdom came from staying silent. That dignity meant enduring quietly. That to love your children meant to disappear for them. That self-worth was best proven through sacrifice. But now she spoke, not in arguments or declarations, but in the way she held herself. In the way she took up space at the market, laughed with her mouth open, corrected people gently when they mispronounced her name. She had begun saying her full name again, Margaret Rose Whitmore, not just mom, not grandma, not her, but a whole person. Elaine noticed it first. "You answer differently when people ask about your past," she said one evening. "I don't hide anymore," Margaret replied. The change wasn't loud, it was deliberate. She began sharing more of her story, not for pity but for power. Not just the years she spent being invisible in her son's house, but the decades before that. The sewing jobs she took to make ends meet. The books she read by flashlight when she was too tired to sleep. The garden she built from nothing but dry earth and hope. She told Elaine stories she'd never spoken aloud before. "I once danced on a table in Paris," she said. Elaine laughed. "You're lying." "I am not." "What were you doing in Paris?" "Running," Margaret said, "from a heartbreak." "And did it work?" "No, but the dancing helped." They laughed for hours. The next day, Elaine painted her mother on that table, arms raised, hair loose, a laugh in her mouth. She titled it, Unburdened. Margaret began receiving more letters, from women who saw her in themselves. From daughters who never said the words they meant, from mothers who were afraid to leave, from grandmothers who forgot they still mattered. They weren't asking for advice. They were asking for reflection, and Margaret gave it to them. In handwritten notes, in blog posts, In recipes that came with little stories, the bread she made when Elaine had her first heartbreak, the cookies she baked after her husband's funeral, the soup she'd once spilled, an accident that changed everything. I thought I'd be afraid to speak, she wrote in one post. But the truth is, silence was heavier than anything I've ever said aloud. She wasn't trying to be a leader, she was trying to be whole, and in doing so, others followed. They began hosting small gatherings, just women sitting on blankets by the beach sharing stories. Some were soft, others were sharp, some were told through tears, all were honored. One woman, barely 30, whispered, "I didn't know it was allowed to leave, to say no." Margaret took her hand. "It's not just allowed," she said, "it's necessary." Elaine watched her mother with new eyes. "I used to think you were quiet," she said once. "I was," Margaret answered, "but not because I had nothing to say." They began recording some of their conversations. Not interviews, just talks about aging, about boundaries, about love that doesn't hurt. They posted them online. And slowly a community grew, not a following, a family. People from across the country sent letters, pictures, gifts. A quilt from a widow in Montana. A basket of apples from a retired teacher in Vermont. A poem from a teenager in Nevada who had just told her parents she didn't want to go to college yet. "You remind me," one letter said, "that there is life after decisions you regret." Margaret kept every note. Lined them up on the wall above her writing desk. She called it her wall of voices. Because each one was a reminder that stories matter, that speaking isn't arrogance, it's reclamation. Elaine added a small plaque above the letters. It read, "The world wasn't quiet, we just weren't heard." Margaret often sat at her desk now, not writing to forget but to remember. She began drafting a book, not a memoir, a map, a guide for women like her. She called it When the Quiet Ends. A life reclaimed. Each chapter was a story, a recipe, a letter to her past self. She didn't worry if it would sell. That wasn't the point. She was speaking, and that was enough. One afternoon, while sorting old papers, she found a drawing, one she'd forgotten she kept. A stick figure, two women, a house, a big smile on one of the faces. Lily's drawing. Margaret pressed it to her chest. And then she framed it, hung it beside her window where the light touched it every morning. She still didn't know if she'd ever see her granddaughter again, but she no longer held that hope like a wound. She held it like a prayer, soft, possible, alive. And if that day came, she would have stories to share, not of pain, but of growth. Of laughter, of days spent by the ocean, dancing barefoot, planting rosemary, speaking truth with a steady voice. Not because she had to, but because she could. It was early. The sea was still. The sun had not yet stretched over the horizon. Margaret stood barefoot on the sand, the hem of her linen pants damp with morning tide. Beside her, Elaine carried her sandals in one hand, her other resting gently in the crook of her mother's arm. They walked in silence. Not out of habit, but reverence. Because peace, when it's real, doesn't need to be explained. They had walked this beach for over a year now. Barefoot, side by side, carrying nothing but themselves. They had learned to leave behind what no longer served them, the sharpness of old wounds, the ache of past expectations, the voices that once defined them. The ocean didn't ask where they'd been. It welcomed them, every morning, with its rhythm. Its forgiveness, its indifference to history. Elaine reached into her pocket, pulled out a little jar filled with sand and tiny shells. She knelt, dug a small hole, and placed the jar inside. A quiet offering. "To all the women who stayed too long," she whispered. Margaret nodded. "And to the ones who left too late." They covered the jar with sand, not to hide it, but to plant it. Back home, letters still arrived, messages, emails. Boxes of homemade cookies, a scarf, a seashell necklace, a poem stitched into a pillowcase. All from women who said the same thing in different ways. "I thought I was alone, until I found your voice." Margaret never called Evan back. She didn't need to, not out of anger, but because she had nothing left to explain. Some days she still thought of Lily, wondered if she ever received the letters, the postcards, the drawings, if she remembered her grandmother's cookies. If the smell of cinnamon ever made her pause. One day another letter arrived. The handwriting was neater, more confident. "Dear Grandma, I got your postcard, I kept it under my pillow. I didn't tell Mommy, I didn't tell Daddy. I didn't want them to take it. I hope you're okay. I hope you're happy. I remember the cookies. I remember your laugh. I want to come visit one day. Love." Lily. Margaret cried, not from sorrow but release. She wrote back. Told Lily about the bakery they ran from their kitchen. about Elaine's paintings, about a cat that sometimes visited but refused to come inside, about dancing at gas stations and painting balconies yellow. She told her she was loved. She didn't say anything about Evan or Rachel. That wasn't Lily's burden. Margaret included a small card with the letter. On it, in her own handwriting, she wrote, "You are not too much. You are not in the way. You are not dead weight. You are breath. You are memory. You are presence." The card went into the envelope, along with a tiny dried lavender sprig. It wasn't an attempt to fix anything. It was an offering, a seed. Margaret placed it in the mailbox, then sat on the porch with her tea. Elaine joined her moments later. "I think I want to write too," she said. Margaret smiled. "Then write." So she did. Together they began drafting a joint book. A collection of stories, not just theirs, but of women like them. Mothers, daughters, sisters, strangers. Each chapter ended with a note from Margaret: "If they only remember you when the bills come due. If they only call when they need saving. If they only see your worth after they've drained your heart dry. Let your silence be the final answer. Let your leaving be the lesson." They titled the book not Dead Weight. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, and that was enough. They grew older, not quietly but boldly. They bought mismatched dishes. They hosted tea circles. They danced under moonlight when the music from a neighbor's apartment was just right. They lived, with volume, with grace. One evening, as Margaret stood at the kitchen counter slicing lemons, Elaine said, "Do you ever wish you'd left sooner?" Margaret paused, then smiled. "No, because I left exactly when I believed I could." That night she wrote her final letter, but this time it wasn't to Lily or Evan or even herself. It was to every woman who had ever been told she was too much, too loud, too emotional, too inconvenient. To every woman who had been silenced by love disguised as duty. To every grandmother who sat in the corner like furniture, waiting for someone to remember she was still alive. It read, "You are not invisible, you are not expired, you are not a burden. You are the story that others will one day tell when they find their own strength. You are the warmth they miss when you walk away. You are the silence that speaks louder than shouting. You are not broken, you are rebuilding." And when Margaret finished writing, she folded the letter, slipped it into the back of her journal, then stepped outside into the twilight, into the sound of waves and the smell of salt. Elaine was already waiting, sandals in one hand. Smile in the other, they walked, side by side, unburdened, unapologetic, unforgiving.